You're all very, very welcome today. This is an initiative which has been taken by the party's National Uniting Ireland subcommittee, which has been responsible for launching our party's Commission on the Future of Ireland. And we view the Citizens' Assembly as being having a pivotal role to play at this particular phase of politics on the island, with constitutional change now fixed on the horizon. Citizens' assemblies have the potential to help us frame the debate, prepare the ground, and take the necessary steps in advance of a unity referendum being called to involve wider society, all strands of civic opinion and political opinion throughout the island. And Sinn Féin's position is to seek the Irish government to make a decision to convene an all-island Citizens' Assembly to address the future of the island. And this meeting today is about bringing some additional value to that discussion, which is already taking place, to raising awareness around the importance and the process of citizens' assemblies. And we're really delighted to have, if they don't mind me saying so, two effective experts in the field to share their thoughts, their wisdom and their experience of the citizens' assembly processes in the past, over the last few years here in the island, on the island. Our first speaker will be Tom Arnold. Tom is a former chair, chief executive of Concern. Latterly, he chaired the Constitutional Convention between 2012 and 2014. He has written extensively on many issues relating to food security and European relations and Ireland's role in Europe. He has been formerly involved with the IIEA. We share a particular interest. We have a mutual admiration for one of Ireland's most iconic revolutionary figures, that's being Roger Casement. So we have that in common and much else besides, I'm glad to say. Our second speaker is Alva Smith, and Alva is a long-time activist on behalf of women's rights, gender equality and equality in Ireland. She's a noted academic. She was pivotal to the Repeal the 8th campaign. She was central to the achievement of marriage equality in this state. I consider her to be a real mover and shaker when it comes to mobilising society, developing strategies and making sure that we effect great change of a social and an economic nature. And Alva herself will bring her own unique perspective to bear on the issue in hand today, citizens' assemblies. So we're going to begin with a presentation in the first instance from Tom. Then we'll revert to Alva. And at that stage, we'll open up the floor for observations, comments, questions, or feedback from yourselves to the two presentations we're about to hear from both Tom and Alva. And I have to say, Marachal Skur, we are absolutely delighted that both of them have made themselves available for this event. Jerry Adams didn't think that we would be able to get Tom and Alva to come along. And he was convinced otherwise. So we could not have two more specialist and erudite and thoughtful and imaginative thinkers to share their thoughts with us here today. Tom.
I want to talk about the experience of citizens' assemblies in the Republic, draw lessons on how they've operated, and discuss how these lessons may be relevant to the possibility of holding a citizens' assembly on Irish unity as proposed by Sinn Féin. This little booklet, Our Future Less Plan for It, gives a very good summary of the 5 citizens' assemblies that have happened between 2012 and 2022. Each assembly consisted of 100 people with an independent chair. The Constitutional Convention had 2/3 citizens, 1/3 politicians. The 4 subsequent citizen assemblies only involved citizens. I want to focus on 2 issues which were the most politically significant that have been dealt with by the Citizens' Assembly. The Constitutional Convention dealt with same-sex marriage, and the first Citizens' Assembly dealt with abortion law reform. I do so because these issues were the subject of lengthy, indeed decades-long political and societal debates here. Arguably, in both cases, the work of the assemblies played an important part in assisting the political system in preparing for major societal change. But the key point to make is that society itself was ready for that change, voting in referendums in 2015 for same-sex marriage and in 2018 for reform of the 8th Amendment. In effect, the recommendations of the assemblies just accurately reflected the changed societal mood. I want to focus on what I think are 2 key points. First, the political legitimacy underpinning the assemblies, and secondly, the different processes within the political system used to reflect the separate issues of same-sex marriage and abortion reform. The Constitutional Convention was established on the basis of an Oireachtas resolution in July 2012. There had been constructive discussions between government and opposition before the resolution was presented to the Dáil, where it was unanimously agreed. Thus, the Convention had a critical political legitimacy when it started its work in January 2013. The Convention consisted of 100 people, 66 citizens representative of the population, 33 politicians, and myself as independent chair. Political parties in Northern Ireland were invited to participate, and 4 did: Sinn Féin, SDLP, Alliance and Green Party, and all of them participated very fulsomely and well. This meant there were 29 politicians from the Oireachtas year, reflecting the party strengths. The Oireachtas resolution specified the 8 topics the Convention was asked to consider and make recommendations on. These topics included the voting age, the electoral system, and same-sex marriage. Very important to note that the Convention was one link in a 3-link chain. First, the Convention would deliberate on an article in the Constitution, recommend if it should be remain or changed, and then produce a report. Second, within 4 months, the government was required to respond to the Convention's recommendations in a special debate in the Dáil. Third, for those issues which would go to referendum, it was the government's responsibility to frame the question on which the people would make their sovereign decision as to whether or not the Constitution should be changed. For the Citizens' Assemblies subsequent to the Constitutional Convention, the Oireachtas established special committees to deal with the Assembly's report. The government then considered the 2 opinions, the Assembly and the Oireachtas Committee, and decided if an issue should be brought to referendum. And this is what happened in the case of the repeal of the 8th Amendment, which was passed by referendum in May 2018. So, what has been learned over the past 10 years from the workings of the 5 assemblies? First, that assemblies can work effectively and can add to the overall democratic process. Secondly, that the assemblies need to be grounded in political legitimacy and to work constructively with the wider political system. And third, that there should be learning from each separate process. The political system has been imaginative in examining the reports of the citizens' assemblies, in developing the report's recommendations and bringing their own perspective to it, and then in preparing the ground for the government to take its decision on bringing a referendum proposal for the people to decide upon. How might these lessons be relevant to the establishment and conduct of a citizens' assembly on a topic as broad, complex, potentially divisive, and multidimensional as Irish unity. I think a key point to make is that a well-designed citizens' assembly on Irish unity would be one small part of a much wider political and social debate on the issue involving civil society, business, academics. A debate which should be based on the principles enshrined in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and which should be conducted in a spirit of generosity and inclusion and respect for the widely diverse views there will be on this subject. In the interest of balance in the debate today and into the future, I should refer to work done on this broad topic and the conclusions drawn from two eminent political scientists, Brendan O'Leary of the University of Pennsylvania and of Queen's University, and Jane Souter of Dublin City University, who also served as an advisor to the Constitutional Convention. Brendan O'Leary has recently published a book, Making Sense of a United Ireland. Should it happen? How might it happen? And I think this book is a serious examination of the many dimensions of moving towards a united Ireland. But in this book he writes, he said, a cautionary tale on citizens' assemblies. When conducted well, they tell us what the public is likely to think when it is better informed. They are much less good as all-purpose meetings on subjects without clearly defined binary choices. Specifically, I am not recommending citizens' assemblies on Irish reunification, but rather citizens' assemblies on defined questions related to the possibility of reunification, such as, should the Government of Ireland define a model of a united Ireland before the Northern referendum, or should it allow that referendum to take place as an answer to a question of principle, leaving the definition of a model to a constitutional convention. Jane Souter has written in an essay in the series Irish Studies in International Affairs, analysing and researching Ireland North and South, and she has written as follows. Citizen assemblies or other deliberative methods are no panacea. There are risks as well as opportunities, and these are heightened in a divided society and heightened further when the political issue at stake is one of identity. In order to achieve the broad principles of both inclusion and moderation, we must ensure we attend to the likelihood of a unionist party veto. In a recent public discussion, nationalists and neutral participants favoured the use of citizen deliberations, while almost no unionist did. So this raises the question as to how to facilitate a discussion between citizens about the future if one part of society refuses to take part. She also wrote, these challenges for deliberation are likely to be particularly significant in a deeply divided society and crucially are not without risk. Indeed, there are those who warn that it is simply not possible in deeply divided, segmented or polarised societies, and it could backfire and inflame sectarian political conflicts. So drawing to a conclusion and drawing on my experience of chairing the Constitutional Convention and observing the work of subsequent citizens' assemblies, I would make the following 3 points. Firstly, citizens' assemblies have been an important addition to our democratic system over the past decade, and Ireland is seen as an international leader in their development and use. They have assisted the political system in addressing a number of complex societal issues and have contributed to changing the constitution on same-sex marriage and abortion. Second, there may be a role for a well-designed citizens' assemblies in the debate on a future united Ireland. But given the degree of polarisation on this issue within Northern Ireland, it will be difficult to secure unionist participation in such an assembly, given that a key principle of citizens' assembly is that citizen participants should be representative of the population. It will be difficult to secure political legitimacy for an all-island citizen assembly on Irish unity. And thirdly and finally, The debate on the future of the island, whether it be a shared island, a united Ireland, or some other term, will undoubtedly continue to grow. The hope is that it will be conducted in a fully peaceful and democratic manner, inspired by the principles of generosity and conclusion. But the best hope of having such a positive debate will be within a properly functioning political system on the island of Ireland, reflecting the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, the restoration of the Assembly and the Executive in Northern Ireland, substantial improvement in relations between the Irish and British governments, and the development of a mature and mutually beneficial relationship between the EU and UK in a more positive post-Brexit era. I thank you for your attention.
Alva Smyth and Arnold and Ailbhe
Welcome. Yes, Mary, I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm perfectly sure that Jerry knew I would say yes to doing this, because just as it's your vision in Sinn Féin to have and to see and to be part of a united Ireland, so it is mine, and that of very, very, very many other people throughout the island of Ireland. It was a pleasure to listen to Tom and his very measured and experienced expose. I'm coming from a very different perspective, an activist perspective of someone who was engaged in pushing for citizens' assemblies, really, I suppose, and also of being actively very engaged. So this I'm going to fly through in apparently 7 minutes, which I don't know if I quite managed that, a kind of a how-to in relation to a kind of a basic scaffolding for an issue-based referendum campaign. So I have 3 main points. The first one is the key elements of an effective referendum campaign. Secondly, the Citizens' Assembly, and looking at a point that Tom raised about risks and opportunities. And thirdly, then, coalition building. The key elements, first of all, obviously clarity of purpose. What you want to achieve, what you want to change is absolutely key, and being able to state that very clearly. Having a clear strategy, how this is to be achieved. In this case, I think probably via a referendum. Thirdly, timing and time frame. Never ever underestimate the time it takes to build a campaign to move the electorate all over the island. Badly timed or rushed referendum campaigns very rarely succeed, and I think that we could all quote examples. There has to be strong, consistent leadership, not telling you anything you don't know. Clear, very simple, very well-researched messaging. The simpler, the better. Lobbying, endless lobbying, not least to get a citizens' assembly in the first place, then to get a referendum, then to keep everyone on side, and then, of course, to win. Public involvement, engagement, activism, including feet on the street, not only on social media, is key throughout. I will also mention donating, because money matters, although, to tell you the truth, it's never my first concern, because I believe it always comes when it's needed. And my final point in effective principles, key elements for campaigning, is unity. And I can't say that enough, and I mean a unified campaign. Unity, unity, unity has to underpin everything. The broader and the more unified the reach of the campaign, the more effective it can be. And it's very important to remember that a referendum is a vote by the people, all those who can vote, for the people, everyone, all those who reside on the island. And I think that all of those principles apply throughout the stages of any issue-based campaign. Second point I want to raise is the Citizens' Assembly and the risks and opportunity. It is, of course, as both Declan and Tom have said, very important to understand how a Citizens' Assembly can serve as a key tool and a milestone towards achieving the overall aim. It is by no means the only element, but it can actually become this kind of pivot point, which it certainly did in both the marriage equality and Repeal the Eighth campaigns. So it's absolutely crucial to organise and strategise for it as a fundamental part of the overall campaign. It's like a mini campaign, and it's very good practice. The risks, however, are, I will only fly over them now. Obviously there is the risk of polarisation in a unification campaign, and that is one that has to be thought through and dealt with. There is also the problem overall of low public interest, perhaps particularly in the South. There is the problem of weak recommendations coming out of the CA. You can't guarantee that you're going to get the answers that you want. The government not at all or only partially implementing CA recommendations is a further risk. And then there is one which is more difficult for political parties to deal with, which is that it can be seen as too political, overly dominated by political parties. And I think that the inclusion of politicians as Citizens' Assembly members does need very close consideration. There are pluses, but there are also minuses. The electorate do not generally like overt political management of referendum campaigns. The electorate, we like to think that this is something that comes from us, that it's our idea, that it's our decision, that it's our choice to do whatever it is. And you interfere with that, I think, at your peril. But first of all, of course, you have to catch your Citizens' Assembly. That's not so much a risk, it is actually a challenge. I think that the aim of any really well put together campaign has to be, of course, to reduce or to mitigate all of these risks. In relation to First Catch Your campaign, that is about lobbying for a Citizens' Assembly now at a constituency level, a local level, and at an all-island and a national level and an all-island level. Close and strategic engagement with the Citizens' Assembly process is very important throughout. Support for campaign or coalition members engaging with the Citizens' Assembly becomes very important to support them to make well thought out submissions with common aims, language, tone, thrust and drive. It's very important. The Citizens' Assembly provides an opportunity for public education and awareness raising, but you have to make sure that you actually take on to do that work to overcome the risk of low interest. And of course, smart communications using social media and local media in particular actually to highlight and maximise attention. But having said something about the risks very quickly, the opportunities are great. It gives great issue visibility, focuses attention on the issue, and it also helps you to educate the public and to grow and strengthen the campaign and to activate campaigners. It gets everybody moving. It gets everybody moving in a concerted direction. And secondly, it also provides a fantastic opportunity for argument testing. It's ready-made for developing, fine-tuning, testing the arguments about unification or reunification through expert testimony as well as through the organisation and individual submission process. It's about finding out what resonates with the public, what does the public think, and how can we make it think maybe a bit differently. It also, very importantly, moves me on to my third and final point, which is it provides a basis, a target, an aim for coalition building. So you might say, well, why build a coalition? And the answer is very, very, very simple. Ní neart go gairla chéile, and never was a truer word spoken. It is vital to bring together a broad campaigning group, all focused in the same direction, singing more or less the same kind of tune. That then becomes the engine for driving the campaign in a coherent, strategic and unified way. A fragmented campaign is not an effective campaign, it is quite simply a mess. I have experience of watching and observing fragmented campaigns. You will note my language there, and I think that they are not winning campaigns. But unity does not come dropping from the sky. It is made, it is constructed, it is composed, and that's not an easy job. It takes patience and it takes time. It's about identifying your allies, respecting them, whatever other differences you may have. It is not the time for turning up your noses about the things that you don't like about the allies. It's about looking at the things that you share, what it is you have in common, and how you can actually use that commonality to fight for a common aim, which in my view would also be for the common good. It's always about building relationships, and as everybody here knows, building, maintaining, sustaining, nurturing, developing, growing relationships takes a great deal of time and patience. A campaign needs to bring together, it's already been mentioned, all the major stakeholders. And the difficulty in a referendum campaign, of course, is the stakeholders are nothing less and nothing more than the people. It's, of course, about breadth and depth, inclusion and diversity within your campaigning vehicle, so to speak. It actually counts more than numbers. You need a cross-section of the electorate, geographical, social, political, cultural, the lot. You have to cast your net wide and deep, but you start off always with the ones you know are already on side to form a kind of core organising group. You're not looking for agreement on all the details, but rather having in common an overall vision and commitment to the change that you want to bring about. The core group then go out into the world to network and lobby in common and lobby and grow and multiply membership of the coalition. I remember I used to end meetings, go out, grow and multiply, because that is what it is actually about. You want to draw in, of course, all of the key demographics and sectors and communities. Young people, women, migrant and new communities, trade unions, human rights organisations, other NGOs, rural, urban, with the widest possible geographic spread, and I could obviously go on. A point may be worth bearing in mind, and it goes back to an earlier point I made, is that the clearer the emphasis is on a broad civil society coalition and campaign, the more effective you can be. For a referendum, a heavily politically marked coalition may well prove to be more of a liability than an asset. As the coalition grows beyond its original core, it can then work out its operational procedures and fine-tune its strategy. But you keep it simple, open, participatory and consensus-based. Bear in mind, it's not a trade union and it's also not a political party. It doesn't need all the kind of hooplas that surround both of those kinds of organisations. The coalition can then, so the coalition, it means, can actually be part of that demand, that pressure, can be the vehicle that drives or helps to drive the pressure for a citizens' assembly to be held within a specific time frame. And it can put forward how it thinks it should be constituted and its terms of reference. The suggestions, the proposals may not be followed, but they will be noted, they will be heard, and some of them will indeed be followed. And that is already positioning that coalition as a key player in an overall referendum campaign. It can, and should, in my view, play a role in interacting with the Citizens' Assembly Secretariat, in preparing and supporting coalition members' submissions, in proposing expert speakers, and in managing traditional media, and, as far as possible, in seeking to manage social media, which is really one of the biggest challenges facing any referendum campaign over the next few years, I think. If the coalition plays its hand right in relation to the Citizens' Assembly, it will go on to become the strong, unified basis for the civil society campaign for reunification. And finally, I can't stress enough that the sooner that kind of coalition gets going, the better. The best time is always now. So Ganairi on Boherlin. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the inputs. Just a little bit of comment around where young people fit in the equation when we're looking at a citizens' assembly, and how important they might be in terms of campaigning and inclusion. For me, and people know me, I'm a broken record when it comes to young people, but they will be the future custodians of the decision, but they'll also be monitoring the how of the campaign, the types of conversations, the polarisation or not. So I'm just wondering, in your experiences, how important do you see the voice and inclusion of young people? And I suppose the creativity around that and how valuable that can be in terms of campaigning. In my experience, the repeal and the marriage equality, young people who didn't even have a vote were involved in those campaigns, and that was then nurturing for them in terms of being part of their own democracy. So I'd love to hear a comment on that. Thanks.
My good Dermot, Mullen Oigel is Chucky She. The person to your right, well, to your left, my right.
There's a growing number of unionist loyalists that are open to United Ireland, but how would you recommend getting them onto the Citizens' Assembly so that we can hear their concerns and their opinion?
Good question. Good to see you again too. And who is this over on the right, please? Yes, Jana Ray.
I suppose given Tom's experience around the Constitutional Convention, do you think that the current government would implement the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, and how can we avoid the years of delay that might come into effect?
In the composition of who's sitting in the citizens' assemblies, young people should be represented proportionate to their size. I mean, there's a full range of age has to be reflected in the composition of the thing. But there was a particularly, in the same-sex marriage referendum, particularly active engagement of young people. Alva will probably be able to talk with more authority here, but even in the last week or two before that happened, there was a group called #ComingHomeToVote, and there was a huge amount of enthusiasm, and they, I think, brought a level of energy into the whole debate and commitment, which was very important. On the issue of loyalists' willingness, loyalist/unionist willingness to participate in a citizens' assembly, I think that, I mean, all the evidence suggests that is if you like, a problem. That there is a at the moment there's no evidence that there would be such a willingness. There's no evidence over the past 4 decades that unionism is prepared to engage in some of the broader things that have been put in place. If you go back to the New Ireland Forum in the 1980s, and they were unwilling to engage in the Constitutional Convention, etc. So that's a genuine issue. Will there be any change in that view? I find it hard to see that there will, and that does raise a question, as I said at the very end of my presentation, about the political legitimacy of an all-Ireland Citizens' Assembly on the issue of our Irish unity. The third issue is, would the government implement recommendations? Well, I think that, in fact, the record is, I mean, many people were suspicious of the government in setting up the first Constitutional Convention. They felt that, particularly on the issue of same-sex marriage, it was just an opportunity to kick the ball down the road. As it turned out, the moral and political importance of the convention coming up with a very clear-cut recommendation in favour of change of the constitution in this issue, I think left the government with actually no other option but to go down the road of a referendum. And I think the same thing actually applied on the issue of the abortion. which was handled, I think, extremely well by the subsequent Citizens' Assembly, chaired by Mary Lafoy, a Supreme Court judge, and then supplemented by some very good work at the level of the Oireachtas, subsequent to the recommendations of that Assembly. So I think it goes back to my basic point that to be most effective, a Citizens' Assembly has to be working in full communion, if you like, with the political system. And that's the way that change is likely to happen.
Great, thanks. Well, first of all, on young people, I mean, absolutely agree that the involvement and engagement of young people is very, very important. I mean, I think that that's something that would happen in any case, but it does mean that particular efforts and particular pathways has to be made very, very clear to young people and to all of the groups and organisations where young people are, that they are more than welcome, that they are positively, actively encouraged to become involved in the campaigning. For all kinds of reasons, yes, it's their future, and I personally feel very, very strongly about that, but also they have a bolder, less fettered vision of the world. They have a very different way. I'm talking about from the height, which is now considerable, of my generation, and thinking about, you know, the generation of grandchildren and so on. And it is a very different approach to the world, and it is a different kind of energy. And there is another very good, very practical reason. That generation are the ones who understand how to operate social media effectively and how to make it actually be a winning tool, and never underestimate that. That's so important. Secondly, I agree absolutely with Tom in relation to the inclusion or the difficulties in achieving the inclusion of unionist, perhaps even loyalist voices and participation in a citizens' assembly. But rather than saying it can't be done, I think the challenge is to go out and test that and to see where are the break points, where are the fissures, where are the areas, where is there not so much a weakness in unionism but an openness. Where is that openness, and pursue that and work on that rather than be defeated by it before you even get going. That is the challenge. Everybody knows that's the challenge, and it's up to all those of us who fight for it to actually go and find the solutions. If you're not going to look for solutions, don't bother even thinking of having a referendum, because that is actually what it's about. Thirdly, implementation. Well, you know, I had reservations about the Constitutional Convention. I thought it was an awful hoo-ha to have to go through when it should have been a very straightforward thing. In fact, it turned out extremely well, not least because of yourself, Tom, if I may say so. But also, I did have reservations about the about the Citizens' Assembly for appeal, because it did look as if it was very much about government giving itself an out. If the Citizens' Assembly didn't say this is a good idea, government could say, oh well, citizens don't think it's a good idea, therefore we won't do it. But of course, government got a right smack in the face when the citizens said, not only do we think it's a good idea, but we don't really like the terms you're setting out for us, we want to do something bigger and bolder, which did actually get knocked back by the Oireachtas the All-Party Committee. But you know, I think that that's a risk you have to take with the Citizens' Assembly. The bad recommendations, poor recommendations not being implemented. That's why you need that kind of managerial approach to a Citizens' Assembly to try to ensure that doesn't happen.
Just on this issue, I think the Alliance Party will be pivotal in this debate, and is it still practical for them to sit on the fence as regards the constitutional issue, and is there any way of opening inroads with them and that debate to start to find out exactly what the position is on this subject?
Thank you, John. And there was someone, yes, yourself?
I'm just wondering to what extent, Tom and Ailbhe, do you consider that maybe the diaspora, in the context of citizens Irish unity, would be a stakeholder? And or what is a risk then in terms of the perception of outside influence, undue outside influence being brought to bear?
Very good. And Rita?
Thanks very much. I'd like to. I think that it's really important as Republicans that we're always very welcome to unionist engagement in this conversation. But I was at the Ireland's Future event there in the Point Depot, still the Point Depot, the Point Depot for me. But I think that the most interesting and the most kind of engaging conversation that happened there actually came from two members of the unionist community, Reverend Karen Sutherman and Ben Collins. And I think that it's just something that's inherent in Republicans, that we feel that partition was wrong because it was a failure. It was a failure to for the whole island to engage. But I'm very worried about the government waiting until political unionism is ready to engage in the Citizens' Assembly, and I think that that's a mistake. That that there are people in the unionist community who are willing to, in civic unionism, to engage in the conversation. And do you think it's important that the government don't wait until political unionism is ready to engage? That we should, because the prize is really healing that tear in our country that should never be there. That border.
We'll start with Alva.
Okay, thank you. The first point, I think, I'm not sure I heard it absolutely, was that about government sitting on the fence?
The Alliance Party.
Oh, about the Alliance Party sitting on the fence. I don't know, I think that they may discover that they have a kind of boldness and courage in them. They are discovering a lot about themselves, I think. So I think they may make a move. I do. Tom will maybe have another view, and others as well. As far as the diaspora is concerned, the one thing the diaspora can't do if it's not and hasn't been resident in Ireland is send money. So you always have to be very careful about watching that. But I think, whether we think it's politically astute or not for the diaspora to be engaged and involved, they will be. And crowds of the diaspora will come home to vote. Whether they're entitled to be voting or not, by the way. So I think the diaspora is an element there that has to be reckoned with and also minded, I think, in a way. I mean, certainly we had big diasporic groups around the world for appeal, and we did mind them. And mind them in the sense of making sure they felt included, but at the same time also making sure that they were having the same kind of information and arguments and materials that we were using here in Ireland. So, that's important. And the third point then is government not waiting on the unionists. But, that's really, that is the job for politicians in a way in the Dáil now, which is to be lobbying themselves, government parties, and indeed government parties to come if necessary, to actually get on with the job. Because if they're going to sit around waiting for political unionists to jump forward towards the Citizens' Assembly, it's never going to happen. So that's a very political job, I think.
Yeah, I don't really have anything much to add on the Alliance Party. I mean, just to say that they were active participants in the Constitutional Convention and played an important role. I think, and since then, of course, in more recent years, their position in Northern Ireland politics has improved, and we'll see. I mean, depending on up to now, I mean, they have probably wanted to sit on the fence. It may change. I don't know. On the diaspora. There was one of the issues we were asked to deal with in the Constitutional Convention was, should the diaspora have a vote in presidential elections? Now, it turned out that question is a lot more complicated than it might look at first viewing, and we teased out some of those complications. But at the end of the day, the convention voted very strongly in favour of allowing the diaspora to have such a vote. Now, that hasn't been acted upon, and it remains still quite a difficult issue, I think, because you come back to the basic issue that, you know, the old principle of the back in the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, etc. So whether that's going to happen anytime soon, I think I would doubt. But what the diaspora certainly should be doing in this broader debate about the future of the island is having a voice, and there should be means to enable that to happen. On the last question from Rada, I mean, clearly, if you were to wait for political unionism before you did anything, you'd be in for a long wait, I think. But the point is that, and I go back maybe to the last point I made in my presentation, if we are to get a healthy debate about the future, there's going to be other things should be providing the framework for that debate. And I do think that getting the institutions re-established in the north is one of those things. There is no doubt that we have, in more recent times, I would say a historic low in the quality of relationships between the Irish and British governments. That needs to change. And then lastly, I mean, everything would be greatly facilitated if we could find a solution to the protocol issue, which I think is entirely possible, and that we move to a different quality of relationship between the UK and the EU. So they're the conditions, I think, whereby a debate about the future can be much more productive.
Would the panel agree that the key element in the reunification of Ireland, in my view, which is overlooked, is the role of the British government? If you examine the Brexit debate and the DUP taking the extreme right-wing Tory side of that debate, and then they were used by a minority Tory government as cannon fodder when it suited the votes in Westminster. It's a reenactment, basically, of the Home Rule debates that occurred in Britain in the 19th century when the Liberal Party split over Home Rule. Now, it is my honest belief that we are in the cusp of the beginnings of a united Ireland, and I say that for this reason. I'll throw three ideas out to you. Number one, Sunak is just a pragmatist, or he has no attachment to Ireland, good, bad or indifferent, and I believe he's going to do a deal with the European Union and operate within the protocol. And like the good old Duke of York, who had 300 men, he's going to march them down again and withdraw that bill in the House of Lords. And the reason he'll do that is Britain is virtually bankrupt and is not in a position to have a trade war with the European Union. Number two, and this is important to focus on, I would like to think that there was some sensible leadership in the DUP, or as the main party of unionism in the north, but I'm afraid there isn't. And it is my humble opinion that they are only using the protocol as an excuse. Number three, I come consequentially from that position to say that for the first time ever, the British government, once they have done the deal with Europe, will bring the DUP maybe into the Privy Council in front of the King and tell them the game is up. We are not backing you anymore. The reason the Unionists are not talking is because they have always looked to Mammy Bull over their shoulder. I was born in the north, educated in the north, in a Catholic boarding school, growing up at the start of the Troubles, and did my A-levels and the outbreak of the fight for freedom in the north, so to speak. People had no choice but to take up arms. And the reality is that until the Unionists know that the game is up and that they can't play the British card, they then have to sit down and negotiate their future. It's not palatable to say that publicly because they'll say, oh, you're against them. I'm not. we need, finally, in the meantime, to start the movement now and bring in civic unionism. And can I say one constructive suggestion? Open discussions with the largest Protestant church in the north, the Presbyterian Church of Ireland. And don't forget that many of them were the founders of republicanism in Cave Hill in Belfast in the early 1790s. These are thoughts that I'm coalescing on. I think tactics are very important, and I think we're entering an exciting stage, but a dangerous stage. And I think we've got to have our tactics spot on. And what we've got to do is to reach out to the decent civic unionism, the Presbyterian Church of the North, and give them a way out that we're going to build a new Ireland. They're not going to be subsumed into the present state, and I wouldn't want them to be. Finally, one final thought. One final thought. Do you not think, everybody in this room, that Tweedledum and Tweedledee don't want a civic assembly or discussion on a united Ireland, NOW, because they will perceive it as turkeys voting for Christmas? I'll leave you with that thought.
Okay, thank you.
Well, my question's for Alva. Was there any difficulties regarding the repeal coalition? There were a number of co-directors. Was there any issues with strong female personality clashing?
Mine is just by way of contribution as a grassroots activist on the Falls Road in Belfast. I'm also a former Republican prisoner who spent 12 years in prison. The reason that's important is I'm a member of an organisation called Coiste Lír Timmy, which is the Republican Prisoners Organisation. And our counterpart on the Shankill Road is EPIC, the Ex-Prisoners Interpretive Centre, which is basically the former UVF prisoners. So we work together on a daily basis. We physically do tours together. I do a half a tour on the falls, get to the big gates in Lanark Way, we call Checkpoint Charlie, and I hand over to the UVF. My own personal story. My grandfather was killed by the UVF in McGurk's Bar in 1871. The loyalists responsible, Robert Campbell, got 15 life sentences. His son, Robert Jr., joins the UVF after his father. And today me and him's the two tour guides. I hand over to him another way. So that's the discussions, that's the debates. Sometimes we go to a couple of Murdoch, the fans club, and we have a Republican, a loyalist, and a former British soldier on the panel. And when you ask the likes of that senior UVF level membership, I'm 64, he would be 65, 66. They actually want the referendum now, because they think they'll win it now. The longer it goes on, the longer it's protracted, they think the more the debates and discussions go on. But that takes us into our community activism. I'm a member of the Falls Residents Association, so I sit once a month with the Falls Shankill Forum. We were set up, we were given a project by the Executive Office to deal with the gates. The gates where I live close at 6:30, open 6:30, close 6:30, and then that was it. So from the 7th of November, because of a cross agreement in the forum, which takes in the UVF, the UDA, local councillors, housing executive, and Belfast City Council representatives, we're now going to move to 7:30 from the 7th of November and into 8:30. The reason that's important is now that the gates issues, we're now forming two subcommittees. One to deal with reconciliation and one to deal with regeneration. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is that debate, there is that discussion within loyalism. But the fact is that their own loyalism is the same age as me. They're being undermined and undercut by a younger generation on the Shankill of UVF. And that's where the danger lies. But I'm saying it's not all doom and gloom. So we're ways away from the Citizens' Assembly, but let's deal with the concrete reality, the objective reality we're dealing with today, and let's try and build on that, and to keep those conversations alive, and to keep those, because question here, Timmy, we're in the nation building, and that's why I do what I do. Go be the
I think I'm trying to be brief here, Declan. I don't think anyone could defend the way the British government have handled the political situation, particularly since the Brexit referendum in 2016. And in a way, Northern Ireland is one of the casualties of that. I mean, there are other people who would say, in fact, that the Irish government could also have had a more constructive role in the intervening period, but I think I would say most of the fault lies with the British government. Within unionism, clearly, the protocol has been used as a way to consolidate support for the DUP. And it has worked. It has worked to the extent that the harder the line taken, the better they've done to get support, the traditional support back. But I think we may be close to the position where there will be a deal done between the EU and the UK. And that then there's going to have to be a judgment call from the leadership within the UP as to whether they're willing to accept that. And then there may be limited enough room to keep rejecting it. And if that is the case, then that's perhaps the gate, the bridge to re-establishing the institutions. So I think there's the beginnings to be of some signs that we may be moving with the Sunak government for all sorts of reasons that is in his own self-interest, given the range of problems he's facing, that it may be in his interest to make a deal with the EU and then get the institutions re-established. That, I think, is, I would hope that's what's going to happen over the next period. And maybe the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement's signature in April next can also help concentrate minds.
Thanks, Tom. I think the question I was asked was, did the fact that there were 3 women leading the Together for Yes campaign, which was the actual referendum campaign, did that lead to clashes and so on and so forth? No, it didn't actually. And that was because we decided it wouldn't. And that the kind of leadership that we were going for, we described the campaign as a feminist campaign, that it did not work along the lines of division, but rather agreement and consensus agreement. And it worked very, very well. And I remember 2 to 3 weeks before the referendum, I know the newspaper it was, I won't bother naming it now, I won't pass my lips, but they actually said something, there was a 2-page spread which said, well, the problem with the repeal campaign is it has no leadership and it's very divided. And of course those were the 2 things that were absolutely wrong about that particular campaign. It had very strong leadership, but it wasn't seen as leadership because it was women and because it was 3 women. I mean, as if 1 woman is bad enough, but like have 3. But Sinn Féin is getting there too, actually. So I really wouldn't be worrying about that one at all. And what I would go on to say, and it really relates to the wonderful words that you spoke yourself there a few moments ago. This year I had the real privilege, I think, actually, to be involved in an Encounters programme, which was part of the All-Ireland Women's Forum. And the encounters were just encounters between women's groups and organisations here in the south and women's groups and organisations in the north. And 2 of the most really wonderful meetings that we had. One was with Women in Loyalism, which is a relatively new group, where women in loyalism are sick, tired and fed up to the teeth of being ignored and silenced, and are speaking out against this. And if that's not a sign of hope, I don't know what is in the world today. And the second one was a wonderful meeting between the Rolandstown women here in the south and the Shankill and Falls Road women's centres. And again, I think that it's so often at that community level and in those places where you don't go looking for it, that you find that practical, pragmatic, working together, solving problems, willingness to at least listen. And that, I think, is absolutely where it's at. It can be seen as all happening at this high level. In a referendum, okay, the high level matters, let's not be foolish, but actually the real work gets done on the ground. And women are fantastic workers, and they're fantastic communicators and fantastic connectors. And I think we all need to be aware of that and use it.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I'm trying to be concise. Just a couple of points. One, this issue of unionism, I think, is coming back to, and some people have picked up on this. Firstly, I would say already civic unionism, a significant number of people within the unionist community are talking about the future, a unity referendum, and a possibility of a united Ireland. We know that for a start because Brexit showed that there was a vote of 56% of people in the north who did not wish to leave the European Union. That had to include a significant number of people from a unionist or Protestant cultural background. The second thing is that already unionism in business, in trade unions, in civic society organisations that Alva has referred to and others, are already discussing these issues, not least because they're terrified about the prospect of what the ruptures now that could be caused if this, for instance, protocol was got rid of when it comes to trade and business across the island of Ireland. The IBEC in the south, the Business and Employers Confederation, already have called for a doubling of the amount of money promised by the government through its shared island unit into building the old island economy. The trade union movement has already agreed that it should be preparing for unity referendums. That's the Congress of Trade Unions. The National Women's Council, I wrote a book which was published called United Nation, The Case for Integrating Ireland, which is out a couple of months. In that book, I discussed with a number of prominent unionists and loyalists, as Tom referred to, who are interested in having the discussion. They're not agreed on the issue of the United Ireland by any means. And you're right, Tom, you're going to be waiting a long time for political unionism to come on board that discussion. The point is it's happening despite political unionism, and they know that as well. So I think there's a lot of movement going on. Ireland's future was referred to. Of course, it's a very significant intervention. Jimmy Nesbitt's speech has changed the dynamic. The Irish Times even had an editorial saying we need to get with this debate as a consequence of Jimmy's courageous speech at that event. And he was graffitied a little bit as a result of it, and that's unfortunate. Those things will happen. So, just in conclusion, in the book, Brendan O'Leary and John Gary, a report on a citizens' assembly they did organise in Belfast in 2019 and 2020 before COVID. And 49 people from Protestant and Catholic or nationalist and unionist backgrounds met together. Half a day in, they thought they'd have to keep Stormont, particularly the Protestant contributors, after a unity referendum, they'd have to keep their separate health and education and everything. And then after a day's discussion, they realised unionism would then be a minority within a minority within those structures, and they ended up coming up with a conclusion that yes, a united unitary state is the long-term solution. President Higgins in my book, and as I mentioned, Ian Marshall, a former senator, unionist, Linda Irvine, Tommy Winston, a UBF guy from the Shankill, all of them are prepared to engage in the discussion. As what Michael D said in his contribution was, we should start on what we agree on. I'm not convinced that one citizens' assembly will be enough, that 100 people can do this. It could be a series of assemblies. That has to be thought out. But in principle, I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Alva, Tom, I think for you to know that there's a number of us Republicans in this room, and we're hearing what you're saying. You know, we're listening to the advice and guidance that you're giving us, and we're listening intently. One thing that struck me, Alva, when you were talking about we have to do more work collectively, not just Republicans, but people in society. And it's picking up on what Frank was saying, because I think it's trying to find that common ground. And whatever about the current British Prime Minister, what he's able to achieve, if he is able to get an agreement with Europe and they try to resolve the issue of the protocol, the mess with the protocol is always going to be with us for as long as this country is partitioned. So given what Frank has said about the number of people in the north that voted to remain in the EU, full membership of the EU, to get the democratic pathway back into the EU, for unionist farmers, for unionists who work in the Shankill, who have lost their ESF funding, European Social Fund. And it's not just about funding. It's not just about the funding that farmers or others have lost. It's our rights that have been stripped away from us. It's workers' rights. It's all the rights that the British government are going to light a bonfire under. So I think there's common ground there that we could talk to that section of society about what we're all going to lose and how we have got a peaceful, democratic pathway back into full membership of the EU. But I fear what the DUP are up to is creating the kind of toxicity about Europe in the north. So whatever happens about the protocol, that those people who supported returning and remaining in the EU in the past, we have a lot of work to make sure we build upon that and not lose it.
We should never forget the hunger strikers that died and all the people that died, and I think we should push on really united Ireland as quick as we can. And if the unionists disagree or whatever, I think we should plough on.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that, you know, I'm listening very carefully to what Frank and Martina are saying, and I think that there is a great deal of back and forth of real connection and of openness and understanding about what's at stake, and that is between unionists and other members of the community. I think that has to be built on. I think that would almost be my final thought anyway, that, you know, there is ground, there is fertile terrain that can actually be built on. And I think that it's important, it's incumbent on everybody to recognise where that terrain is, where that ground is, where those fissures are, and to really pursue them in a very kind of single-minded way. Just one point I would make, and it's kind of in response to what you were saying there, was something that I think I said to Jerry earlier on when we were talking about the meeting today, that the stakes are not the same and are not perceived in the same way, north and south. We don't carry that history of real grief and sadness and suffering that so many do in the north. And I think that is something which will and should be addressed, and which will and should come up in and through a citizens' assembly, but that in all of the organising work that we're doing at the moment, that it's really important for that recognition to be there. And it just occurred to me when you were speaking, because you're so right not to forget.
Well, just a brief comment. I think there's no doubt that what Franca says about the situation becoming greatly more dynamic that is a reality, and it manifested in many of the ways he spoke about. But some of that new reality is, of course, the behaviour of the British government since Brexit, and how that, I think, has led to, I would have thought, some questioning on the part of many unionists about their relationship with Britain and about the union. But it's still, I'm not close enough to this issue, but my sense is that parts of unionism, and particularly the loyalism, feel utterly unlistened to at this stage, and feel that they've really no voice, that their interests are not being listened to by anyone else. And that's going to be part of the dilemma, I think, that Donaldson is going to face if you get to a point where there is basically a deal. He's going to have to call it. Is he going to go for that deal or not? And I mean, all the logic is that he should go for it, but that logic and economic rationality doesn't always lead to political decisions. So people can do things that may appear to be not in their best interest, but we're down to identity politics at its rawest. So I come back to this issue. If we can get a framework of collaboration, well, first of all, a settlement with EU, UK, and a better framework of collaboration between the Irish and British government, they seem to me to be the conditions by which you could get some level of normal politics re-established in Northern Ireland, and that is of critical importance.
Thank you, Tom. So, to you both, one final thought that you would like to share with us before we finish.
I never have just one thought in my head, particularly after such an interesting discussion and debate. But my Belfast granny always used to say, I can feel it in my waters. And there's something I can feel myself now in my waters, and I felt it for a while, which was why that point, I'm with you on calling it the point depot, really resonated. That event, I think the timing is right now for this whole movement forward on reunification. That doesn't mean that there'll be a citizens' assembly tomorrow, but I think that timing is absolutely right. Yes, of course, all of the challenges are there, not least the relics of Brexit and the protocol and so on, of course, but there are always going to be problems, so that is absolutely there. There is a whole new generation of young people out there who actually want to move beyond this, who want to leapfrog right over it into a different kind of Ireland, because they have other problems to solve, like the planet, the earth, right? So they want this resolved, they want to move beyond it, and they're there, ready and waiting. The time frame, which is really my thought for achieving this, is another matter, because the timing is right to move now, but it does raise the question about how long this is going to take, and I think that needs really careful thought. My experience is that people will go with you for 3 to 5 years, but they just can't think beyond that. So you give it to them in little bits, like a citizens' assembly coming in such and such. And then after that we move on to whatever, and then whatever. But you need to be thinking, you need to be having a time frame now. That's my practical thought about this. And when I say you, my final thought is, it is not just about you. It's not all about Sinn Féin, right? Let's be clear. This is about the island of Ireland, and there are people like me, not in Sinn Féin, who are actually up for this with you, and I can be multiplied and grow many times. So bear that in mind, and we do need to work together. And we will. Okay.
I suppose the question I have is, how can we begin to build on what might be a more middle ground in Northern Ireland? There's all sorts of elements that I think should be talking together, and they have not. Maybe the beginnings of this talk is going on, but it hasn't translated into any sense that there's a shared vision for the future of this island. My sense is that particularly loyalism are in a very isolated place, a powerless place, and there may be some risk, I don't know what level of risk that is, that some of the younger elements may wish to go back to other ways of expressing themselves, which would be a hugely disadvantaged. So how can Sinn Féin promote this idea of moving towards a United Ireland, talking about a border poll, without that at the same time absolutely consolidating this view within the unionist stroke loyalist community that they are becoming increasingly marginalised and increasingly powerless? That seems to me to be one of the challenges you as a party are going to have to face. I mean, Declan, the first time we met back in 2015, you just produced a book about reconciliation, which I think was hugely important and a valuable book. But you're moving into now, over the next period of time, when indeed, as Alva says, the wind behind this idea of moving towards a united Ireland is much stronger than ever before. But you still have the basic issue, can you bring a significant number of the unionist stroke loyalist community with you in that thinking? And how you resolve that, I don't have an answer to, but I would have thought that, continuing listening, and, in a respectful and positive way, that's the best way forward.
And then to abuse the position of chair, I'm just going to share my last thought, one from me, and that is we've had a very, very productive, enlightening conversation around citizens' assemblies and the processes and the context within which a citizens' assembly might emerge. But we need a campaign. We need to design a campaign with momentum to actually get to the point of having a citizens' assembly, for us then to work out the modalities and the processes and the elements of how that citizens' assembly can be most effective. And that requires a coalition. And that means thinking outside the box and thinking outside and acting outside of our silos. So there's a piece of work to be done from this meeting today. And that is to internalise the quality of the discussion that we've had, to leave the room and think about the importance of a citizens' assembly on the onward trajectory towards a united Ireland and the achievement of constitutional change. Before that, we have to have an exercise of self-determination. But in advance of all of that, we need to have a coalition which wins the argument for a citizens' assembly in and of itself. So to píosa oibre an doing Gallier. Thank you all very much for coming along this afternoon. We have had two absolutely outstanding contributions from Tom and Alva. We were honoured that you accepted our invitation. Your contributions have been exemplary, and I think you have left a big impression on this audience this afternoon. So a big round of applause for our two contributors.